we're both where we are at.
Both where we're at. That's exactly what I was going to say. I have an incredibly bad
right
headache. Yeah, I've been nursing a very bad migraine all day. I hope you've slept recently, Dan, but I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't slept.
I slept.
Okay.
I had a lot of dreams last night, which, you know,
for better or for worse.
For better or for worse, yeah. It's an essential part of sleep, I'm told, but, you know.
That's what they want you to think.
That's what they want you to think.
Big dream wants you to think. I remember early on at the beginning when we started doing the show, we were like, there were vague whisperings about us maybe one day doing some psychoanalysis stuff.
Oh, yeah.
We just kind of haven't. I don't know.
No.
It'd be interesting one day.
Yeah, like, but like, I'm unwilling to be the auxiliary statement psychoanalysis guru, I think.
Which you would have to be.
Which I would have to be, I suppose, yeah. And like, I haven't engaged psychoanalytic theory in a really long time. And had some engagement with psychoanalytic practice, but don't really want to talk about that.
For better or for worse.
So there you go. I don't know. Maybe we'll
we'll figure it out.
Maybe there's something out there.
Yeah, a Marxist approach to dreams. That's what we need.
But it's not like Freudian. It's like some kind of like Crystal Marianne Williamson kind of like, this is what this means if you dream about this. It means
that would be awesome.
Like, I don't know, you want to expropriate your
yeah, it means you're feeling very atomized. Yes, your atomized dreams has atomized you.
yeah. Every you look up every like piece of imagery or every archetype, and it's just like you are heavily alienated at your workplace.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, man, I dreamed about
you should organize
with
your you should organize your workplace, and you should form a Marxist center. And,
exactly. Yeah, you should write a newspaper.
Yes. Yeah. You should make memes. You should, I don't know.
Yeah, make memes. Make the socialist memes. Oh my God! Actually, I meant to mention this to you. On Instagram, I was just like doing brain dead scrolling, and some meme came up, and it was, you know, oh God, I'm gonna sound like such a fucking boomer. It was one of those Instagram posts where you can swipe to the side. There are multiple images. Yes, they've had this for like 10 years. We know this is not a new thing.
I mean, it's news to me.
It's what is this? You post multiple images. They this account was like posting just typical memes, and then like the third or fourth one was just like socialist propaganda, and I was just like, whoa. I was like, it like kind of made me jump, and I went on the page, and it was like not explicitly socialist, but I was just like, wow, this is like somebody's pet project to like try and win over Zoomers.
That's right.
Like, that's so funny.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Meta level memeing. It's great.
Yeah, winning the mind game, the mind war. Yeah. Well, all right. My migraine aside, how capable are we feeling about talking about this? What we need to say is that we read a Loren Goldner essay on the Spanish Revolution. This is from his book. That is, I believe, that we've read one essay on before about reactionary anti-imperialism in Turkey. The book is called, I think, Revolution, Defeat, and Theoretical Underdevelopment. And it's like 4 case studies in different countries in the history of their relationships with socialism. The one we read has a really, really long name about the Spanish Revolution. Spanish Revolution, Past and Future, Grandeur and Poverty of Anarchism, How the Working Class Takes Over or Doesn't, Then and Now. So it rolls right off the tongue. And it is, yeah. It's good, but what we should say right off the bat is Loren Goldner died as we were reading this, which I was trying to think if that's the 3rd time this has happened. I know that when we were recording our episode on The Known Unknown, or whatever it's called, about Donald Rumsfeld, he died as we were recording it, which we felt kind of good about. I don't remember if it happened a second time.
I think we've just I mean, in any context, saying that we've joked about it is in poor taste, but like we have sure. we've joked about it a few times. Like
it was funny when it was Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah. But I think it's I think maybe it's only happened twice, and we shouldn't attach
Unleash
any
Pandora's
particular
box.
power to this podcast and our reading
What
choices.
would my psychoanalysis say about that? Yeah. Anyways, all of that is to say, this is just the second thing we've read of Loren Goldner's, but always been very impressed by his stuff. Seems like he was a real stand-up guy. So of course, major loss, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I know Antifada just put out an episode today as we're recording this that is like rest in peace Loren Goldner, and it was a bunch of his comrades coming on and talking about him. It was very, very good. So go listen to that. But yeah, a bit weird to have picked this and then that happened. So, rest in peace, I suppose. A comrade, Dan. You know how much I love that word.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm looking forward to engaging more with what other people are saying about him and more of his writings. The pieces we've read them in this book have been really enjoyable. This one in particular seems quite like clear-headed in his politics, and I presume, as you say, a good guy as well. So
yeah. So now that that's out of the way, I suppose, Dan, what did you think of this essay?
I enjoyed it. It's brief, and it's not like there are probably well, it's an essay designed to answer a particular question, and it's not a like sweeping statement on the Spanish Civil War / revolution per se. It's actually seeking to answer a much more interesting, pertinent question, which I think all of the essays in this collection do in some ways or other, which is how can we learn from this particular piece of left history? And I'm really pleased that we've sort of visited or revisited the Spanish Revolution, because it's something I know very little about. It's quite a sort of blind spot in my thinking, maybe because I haven't engaged anarchist literature or history in quite the same way I might have done revolutionary Marxist history. But the way it's presented here, it clearly deserves an important place in a sort of like I mean, it's an obvious thing to say that everybody knows, but like it is a pivotal moment in the history of the 20th century and its revolutions. And clearly what Loren Goldner is trying to do here is draw out important lessons for our activism now and what we can learn from the failings of sort of anarchist political and economic decisions that were made in the 1930s. Loren Goldner, as we know, like a left communist, and not necessarily an anarchist. But I guess there's some degree of overlap between those two politics, although some significant differences as well. So this is a great essay for plotting out the main events, the main historical beats of the Spanish Second Republic and it's sort of like the onset of the Spanish Civil War and the eventual takeover by General Franco. But also it's got a lot of like broader historical context for the history of Spanish politics and society that is interesting to learn. And also there's a lot of like more general philosophical considerations around the differences between Marxism and anarchism and how they differ in their political strategy. So all round a very engaging, enjoyable piece to read. I'm glad we did.
Yeah. I think I broadly feel the same. I mean, it's interesting. Like the book that this is from, like I said, it comprises 4 essays, and this is the second one that we've read, and they're all about, I suppose they seem to all be about grappling with defeat and why various movements were defeated. There's obviously the other one that we read was all about Turkey and about its failure to bring about any kind of socialism or communism or any kind of egalitarian society as it relates to as it related to the Young Turk Revolution and to like Soviet foreign policy. And he uses that to kind of make a broader point about like the underdevelopment of the theory behind anti-imperialism and what he calls reactionary anti-imperialism. So in that essay, he was like, you get a lot of people supporting, this was written, before the events of October 7th, obviously. But he says you get a lot of people on the left uncritically supporting institutions like Hezbollah or Hamas, or, Cuba, Stalinist Cuba, or like any other kind of like institution that has fought against American or Western imperialism, just because that's what they did, right? And there's not a lot of criticism going on there. So that was kind of like his, and how that leads to defeat, right? Is kind of what that essay was about. And this one seems to kind of be about like the theoretical underdevelopment of anarchism as it was defeated in the Spanish Revolution. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I know a whole lot about the Spanish Revolution. If I'm being honest, I kind of got not anagram. What is it? What's the word when it's like a CNT, POUM? You know what I'm saying?
Acronym overload.
Acronym. I got acronym overload reading this. Like, even though he like has footnotes every time he brings any of these acronyms up, I was just like, oh my God, what is he talking about? What is the minor difference between this faction and this faction? That's entirely on me because I'm uneducated. I think he is assuming a certain level of knowledge about the Spanish Revolution that I just honestly don't have. But this was very interesting nonetheless. And I mean, the defeat of the Spanish Revolution was of world historic importance. And he says some pretty grandiose things right at the beginning about the Spanish Revolution that made me kind of feel like an idiot for not knowing a whole lot about it. Because he says at one point that the Spanish Revolution was the richest and most deep revolution in human history as it relates to kind of like getting out of capitalism, right? Which I was like, whoa. Okay, you know, I mean, I know the guy's a left-com. I know he's not going to say that it was the Russian Revolution, but like Russian Revolution was like obviously a very, very big deal. And to claim that the Spanish Revolution, he also goes on to say that the peasants in the Republican-controlled areas formed the closest approximation of a self-managed society that we've ever seen, like a complex self-managed society. I was like, whoa, oh my, what have I been missing? Obviously, I knew a little bit about the kind of like guerrilla tactics that were used in the Spanish Revolution and about these kind of different peasant communes that were formed during the revolution. But I kind of just vaguely knew about it as like one of the many kind of like offshoots of syndicalism and of anarchism in general that was eventually kind of like beaten down and beaten back by the like broader Republican movement, the more like not reactionary, but like obviously like less anarchist, less socialist, less progressive, shall we say, elements in that movement. So it was really interesting to see a kind of like full, or at least a kind of like full, but also quite short, brief and truncated running through of all of this history. It really was quite fascinating. And yeah, now whenever I go to an anarchist zine fair, I can be like, oh, that, you know, he was your guy. I can't pronounce guys. I forget the guy's name. Durudi or whatever. He was your guy. Oh, well, yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, the POUM. Oh, yeah, okay. Sure. CNT. Oh, yeah, wow.
Yeah, you can drop in all the proper names and all the acronyms. Exactly. Win ourselves some anarchist friends. Yeah. Like it's that is one of the most interesting elements of this, like that protracted comparison that's made between the social conditions in Spain and the social conditions in pre-revolutionary Russia, and how what different elements there were, but how in a lot of ways, like the conditions in Spain were more ripe almost for like a spontaneous social revolution than they were in a lot of respects in late Tsarist Russia. He also he quotes Trotsky, referencing very favorably the Spanish Revolution in comparison to the Russian one, saying that like it was the deepest or broadest, most successful sort of like attempt at a social revolution. Yeah, I guess like should say to begin with that like he presents his position as in his own personal history as being one which has taken the view that the defeat of the Spanish Revolution was ultimately up to the malign influence of the Soviet Union and Stalinism and the sort of like general foreign policy machinations of the Soviet Union that, I mean, relate heavily to that previous essay we've read from this about Turkey as well. But I think his new revelation that's led him to sort of write this piece rather is to say, well, it's not just simply that It's not just simply that classic kind of left communist critique of Stalinism, but rather that there were fundamental weaknesses in the anarchist approach to politics, I suppose. It's sort of particularly interesting to sort of trace out those things which made anarchism so favorable in Spain. I don't know that like Bakunin and people like visited Spain and Italy quite frequently, and obviously Spain still had quite a significant rural agrarian population. Like its economy was still largely like this. He describes several different sort of like arrangements, but let's loosely say like peasantry, right? Like there was a significant like the bulk of the population of Spain were agricultural workers and peasants, although there were centers of industrial development as well. But like in some respects, that's quite similar to the Soviet Union, right? Like there was burgeoning industry, but still quite a significant peasant population. But whereas in the Soviet Union, there was a general reluctance for the peasants to side with the communists and to side with the revolution. In Spain, like the peasants, the agricultural commune was in some respects like the bedrock of that social revolution that we were just describing as having happened. And that has a lot to do with the sort of political trajectory of Spain, right? Like there is the historic influence of anarchism. There's sort of like the structure of the society down to its sort of municipal level, which was much more in a lot of respects decentralized. Like it had a history of strikes, and it had a history, and it had sort of in some respects organic socialist parties that had come about. But because Spain wasn't a liberal democracy in the same way that other European powers were at the end of the 19th century, there wasn't the sort of those socialist parties and the sort of like reformist tendencies that took over like social democratic parties in other European countries never really won favor in Spain. And instead, there was this sort of general tendency toward anarchist politics rather than sort of loosely Marxist or socialist ones. And therefore, like a different tactical repertoire as well, one predicated on like wildcat strike and sort of spontaneous peasant land sieges rather than like protracted, slow, reformist political action taken through political parties. And clearly, like anarchists were very successful in their propagandizing, and the tactics that they used developed this massive political base. And like one of the most scathing line that Goldner uses in this was like the anarchists had achieved in after the initial Franco coup in 1936, like they were at the point where they'd achieved the most miraculous sort of like anarchist revolution they could ever have imagined, and then they sort of like totally blew it, kind of thing. I can't remember the language that he uses exactly, but like
I think that's it.
Yeah, pretty much.
They totally blew it.
Blew it. What were they doing?
Yeah, I think you're right to point out the like specificity of why Spain was anarchist, because it's such a reminder of kind of like the left communists' whole thing and like Marx's whole thing of like actually studying the real movements of history that lead you to these points as they're going on around you, instead of kind of trying to like lay over a fake map of, and just kind of be like, oh, you should be doing this, you fools. You're right. He definitely points to the decentralization of Spain, and kind of regions, the various regions of Spain that were just always completely at odds for various reasons with Madrid. And that there was kind of just this like, he calls it something like a fake centralization around Madrid, that the central government was never really able to control as much of these regions as they wanted to. And then he also makes the point that because there was no real bourgeois democracy as such going into the 20th century, like a typical one like you would imagine in, Central Europe or in the UK or something like that, that just meant that there was no real room for social democracy to blossom because it didn't really have fertile terrain. And so like instead of getting this kind of merger formula kind of thing, right? That you got in Germany, or, that was attempted to do somewhere like the UK or something like that, right? Like what you actually got was just syndicalism, where it was like, radical unions who kind of thought that they could use anarchism as a way to just like, hey, we'll just get rid of the bosses and the cops and the government, and then that'll be the classless society, right? And the reason I bring this up is because that's like kind of what historical materialism kind of trains us to do, right? Where it's like looking at today's society, it's like, well, how likely would a merger theory type social democracy work? How likely would like ultra left just do the riot thing work? You know what I mean? It's like really, and I think this is kind of Goldner's whole point later on in this essay, is that you really need to understand these forces and not just try and like either repeat the mistakes of the past or just do the thing that doesn't make sense. And I really thought that example that he gave of why anarchism was so big in Spain and not anywhere else, it really clicked when he was like, well, there was no bourgeois democracy to speak of, so you weren't going to get social democracy at all. And yeah, of course, that leads to just like an old-time bag fumble. So
yeah. And what's like you're saying there that what Marx and what Loren Goldner is saying we should do is like engage in a material analysis of concrete political conditions, both now where we live and now in history where we live, if we're looking to engage in the world politically, but also in terms of a historical analysis. That's what we should be looking for when we're trying to explain political happenings in history. But this case, I think what this case of Spain, particularly in comparison to developments in Russia and then the Soviet Union, has taught me is to remember that there isn't any necessary like proper historical way for history to develop. There isn't any like teleological trajectory. I mean, that's what I would say anyway. I don't know whether that's what Loren Goldner is proposing, but like, given a particular set of historical economic conditions, a really high watermark of revolutionary potential was reached, which had as its primary ideological touchstone the writings and theory and political practice of anarchism. It's interesting that you say about anarcho-syndicalism as well. That's the really interesting thing about this, is like there are competing sort of like strains of anarchism, and there's the sort of influence of Bakuninism versus the influence of Kropotkin, and sort of like later developments. I think it's after 1919 there's sort of like a significant strike wave, and it's out of that the CNT, like the primary syndicalist trade union, is formed. But it's interesting that like both in the industrial workplace and in the sort of like on the peasant farm, in an agricultural setting, it can be various strains of anarchism that are the primary political theories that are being referenced, kind of thing. So you don't necessarily need to have like sort of like Marxist political theory is the only one that's able to speak to an industrial setting, kind of thing. Whatever criticisms we might have of anarcho-syndicalism, and I don't know, yeah, predicated on whatever criticisms we might have of mass strike, left communism, or anything else. Like, yeah, those criticisms aside, these political ideologies have clearly had very significant historical impacts that no one can really argue against.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting too that he shows that, and shows the specificity of anarchists, like quote unquote theoretical underdevelopment. But then he also goes on to show how, like what you're saying, there was this kind of mirroring of debates that were happening on the socialist left taking place on the anarchist left in Spain. And how he's kind of like, these debates would take place, seemed like the implication was they take place, independent of whatever your, capital I ideology is for your political movement, right? And he gives the example of reform versus revolution. And he says, just like that was a debate amongst the socialists and the communists, that was a debate amongst the anarchists in the form of insurrectionism and more like, and Kropotkin influenced kind of anarcho-communism, like syndicalism kind of stuff, right? Which I thought was really interesting. I was just like, oh, I actually never made that connection. But, obviously those strategic questions are going to come up whether or not you engage in politics, I suppose.
It's the same material conditions that people are grappling with, so it's going to come up with the same problems kind of thing. And I guess in some respects, different ideologies are able to cope with that, reckoning with those questions.
Some with more dissonance than others in the case of anarchism, because it's just like, what did the anarchists do? They did not destroy the state. So,
yes.
That's Goldner's whole thesis here, right? I mean, maybe we just get onto that, which is that...
that's the next logical thing.
Yeah, which is just that the anarchists, as exactly as you said, made the revolution beyond their wildest dreams. Like, huge amounts of people were on board in terms of the peasantry and the industrial workers, especially in places like Catalonia. And he just says that it came time to have this question of, do we smash the state, whatever that would look like? And he doesn't get into what that would look like. Or do we let it continue? Do we let the banks continue? Do we let, money continue? Do we let all these things continue? And there are different answers for those different things. But on the whole, the answer was, yeah, we'll let them keep going. They took a step back. The phrase that he uses here that was used back then, which people would chant, was "Ira por el todo," which means something along the lines of "go for broke." And they did not go for broke. They took a step back. They balked. And Goldner says, instead of taking the typical like left communist, anti-Stalinist narrative of the of the Spanish Revolution, which was that, the Stalinists kind of fucked everything up, and once the POUM or whatever was like, and the CNT were kind of like put to the side, then the revolution was lost. He was saying this was actually baked into the cake from the ideological like theory behind anarchism. And unfortunately, that led to this kind of balking, which, shame.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Because you'd have thought that the anarchists were the first people to champion
smashing
the state, right?
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily like a reluctance to smash the state, but a total reluctance to engage in a type of politics which is in any way represents something that we might be called like transitional, like
positive.
Yeah. Like they recognize that if they're going to engage political conditions in a sort of, as you say, like take a positive approach to it, they're going to have to establish some kind of dictatorship in some way or other. Like what they're refusing to do is institute a proletarian dictatorship, because what they think the implication of that would be is it would be that anarchists are trying to set up an anarchist state. They don't want to, they're so anti-authoritarian that they don't want to take on any kind of political power which would be used to repress anti-revolutionary political forces, kind of thing. And yeah, Goldner is saying that like that stems from like very fundamental tenets of anarchist philosophy. I mean, he describes it as a form of radical Enlightenment thinking, anarchism, right? Like, which kind of makes sense, right? Like, and in a lot of respects, what it's very analogous to is what Marx would criticize as like being utopian socialism, like it was strange actually for me to like consider this, because I feel like sometimes when speaking on this podcast or in my own thinking, I realize now that like there are times when I entertain this idea, right, which is that like the perfect form of egalitarian society is for anarchists present as a potentiality at any historical moment, like communist and socialist politics represent a positive potentiality if only you were to remove all the negative things imposed on human beings in the form of like the state or unjustified political or violent or some kind of authority placed upon people. And so like for anarchists, the what I get. I mean, I guess in some respect, in some ways, I can understand why they would make this decision predicated on this idea, right? But like, clearly, what was emerging in Spain at this time, in so many different facets of social life, was the development of a sort of like new, liberated individual. People were coming together, forming workers' co-ops, forming peasant communes. They were organizing in some small ways new economic relations. And for the anarchists, there was a reluctance on a sort of very basic level to nurture that, and more importantly, to repress forces opposed to that. And they don't recognize that there is a process of transition from one society to the other, that one has to grow out of the other. All that they recognize is the break, and I guess not the continuity, to return to sort of like something that we've talked about in the past, I guess.
Familiar language,
indeed. Yeah.
It's funny. I think I took a very slightly different. I had a very slightly different take on what Goldner was saying, or maybe a different interpretation. We're kind of saying the same thing, so it's not that different. But I kind of took this as what he was saying was, it wasn't so much like allergic reaction to any kind of proletarian dictatorship that the anarchists had, but it was more so that they just didn't have an alternative, period. You know what I mean? And like, I don't know, maybe that is like an important distinction, because the idea of the dictatorship, like, just because that's the word that's used, it just becomes this idea of it needs to be this long drawn out process of like, you know, the proletarians ruling with an iron fist. But like, at least what we read in the fundamental principles, like that book makes it out to be like the transitional period is incredibly short, actually, because as soon as you're able to institute communist social planning with like their version of labor times accounting, it proves that society proves itself to be more productive and just better immediately. And so like, once that is in place, the transition phase is basically done. And I mean, of course, there's going to be a period of subsumption that goes on after that, where you have to get rid of all the dumb capitalist bullshit. But like, I don't know. When I think about the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's like, to a certain extent, in a lot of these places, the anarchists were just doing that anyway. They just didn't want to call it that because they were facilitating a transition. And they did a lot of really good work, right? Like, obviously, there's a reason he says that this is one of the deepest revolutions in human history, right? Like, the level of self-management that was around the seemingly like kind of spontaneous peasant communes was like pretty miraculous and really impressive. And like, when any kind of anarchist organization, anarchist, socialist, whatever, like, when an organization is facilitating something like that and trying to keep, you know, the wreckers or whatever, like, out and trying to stop the bourgeoisie from coming back, that is what Marx would describe as a dictatorship. And I think that's what any kind of like serious like academic scholar would describe as a dictatorship. You know what I mean? It's just, it's hegemony, you know? So again, yeah, to kind of like make your point again, like this like allergicness that the anarchists supposedly had to a proletarian dictatorship was just that. It was only supposed. It was only like seemingly in name only, and that kind of doomed them. Because I kind of took Goldner to say, like, let's say that they did take this next step and they smashed the state. What would they put in place? I don't know. He doesn't know. I don't think they know. And I think that that's why they stopped. And if, you know, maybe that's the theoretical underdevelopment part of all of this. And the last thing I'll say is that, like, the spontaneous communes and all of that stuff, like, that really impressed me because, like, that kind of stuff seems to just happen throughout history. You know what I mean? And to kind of tie this into what I was saying about the dictatorship stuff, like, the purpose in these revolutionary times is to facilitate them and allow them to grow. Because it's like, okay, let's say in Jack's perfect world, the councilists or whatever had been in like some time traveling Dutch, or I guess not even time traveling, just some Dutch council communist made his way down there and started just organizing the whole goddamn thing and made everybody do labor time accounting. What is it that they would actually be doing in that case? Like some sort of hypothetical councilist Spanish organization. They would be going to where these movements actually existed, to where these communes had already set themselves up, and giving them the tools so that they could actually continue. Because, you know, these communes that kind of, you know, communalized agricultural production in like an incredibly profound way were doomed because they didn't have what the councilists would call a unit of account to facilitate all of this stuff. They didn't have a way to actually organize their quote unquote like politics and their economics so that they could continue doing what they're doing. So I mean, like, maybe that's the merger theory I'm interested in, is like actually going out and finding these movements, because communes like this, these things just happen whether or not communists want them to, whether or not it's the right time in history. And my point is just that, like, the dictatorship, quote unquote, the hegemony is making sure, giving them the tools so that they can actually continue, because I honestly, I don't think that they will on their own. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are several ways I'm sort of provoked to respond to that, I suppose. Yeah, you're correct. I guess there's an extent to which it sort of feels like the dictator, in some understandings, some aspects of what I understand the dictatorship of the proletariat to mean, like, it is happening, at least in the sense of like the immediate aftermath of the initial defeat of the Franco coup, right? And like the spontaneous action of the industrial and the agrarian working classes is what you would want from dictatorship of the proletariat. I think there are sections of this where he does say, in some respects, what they should do, or he does quote somebody from the time. I wish I could remember which it was. You might quote somebody from the time as saying what they should do, and it's not like an economic proposal, but it is a political one, right? He's like, they should facilitate the emergence of something akin to the Russian Soviet, right? Like, they should create workers' councils, facilitate that, and create a political state structure. I shouldn't say state, perhaps, but like create a political state structure which is based on democratic representation of the workplace and of the commune through some kind of federated Soviet workers' council style political system, which they don't do, and in some ways that might represent, in some formulation, that might represent the initial starting point for creating some kind of at least region-wide or even statewide economic organization. Because I think that's the fundamental problem, is that like there was huge experimentation. Like, a lot of the communes would like set up their own schools and institute systems of like, from each according to their ability to each according to their need, and just have social stores for all things and collectivize their private property into communal property, have sort of one member, one vote systems for determining how things were going to be organized. But from what I understand, there was a sort of a gradual breakdown and just a general lack of economic harmony throughout all sections of industry. Now, I mean, just demanding that they create some kind of exchange economy, maybe with labor time accounting as the unit of measurement, is a tall order, or quite a big demand to make of them, kind of thing. But I think so. I think that there's like, his criticism is that the anarchists weren't willing to create some kind of central authority to coordinate economic activity and create political systems that could represent that as well, I think.
Yeah. And he goes into like militarization, right, where the process by which like militias were turned into uniform wearing, order taking, like saluting exactly. Yeah, saluting. I'm trying to come up with a term for that kind of person. I don't know, schmuck, I guess. They were turned into like these fully quote unquote like bourgeois professional units. And one thing that I actually thought was pretty interesting on that subject was he made the point, and I didn't actually really realize this, where he was like, not only does the kind of like anti-Stalinist, typical left communist like argument about the Spanish Revolution not really hold up for the reasons we've already discussed, but he says it also doesn't hold up because it can't account for like why the anarchists were actually still like a huge force to be reckoned with right up until the end of the Civil War in 1939. I thought that was really interesting because
Mhm.
he was like, actually, you know, there were still these like large columns of military units kicking ass. And, you know, how could that have been the case if, you know, the big evil Stalinists came in and just destroyed everything? Which, you know, don't get Loren Goldner wrong. He gives out about the Stalinists. That's like, you know, public enemy number one, especially in the Turkey essay. But the military stuff was very interesting. Anyway, to go back to what you were saying, it's interesting because I kind of got the feeling throughout all of this, and I was surprised because you don't get this in kind of like a lot of ultra left circles. Like, this almost seemed to be a type of like political determinism that I wasn't really expecting. It almost seems like he, like from what you were describing as well, like it seems like he would what he would want out of a society like this would be in some ways pretty similar to McNair in terms, like when he starts talking about the militias, when he starts talking about one person, one vote, all of these different political structures, that, you know, the routes that they could have gone. It did kind of smack a little bit of that, which I thought was really interesting. Now, I mean, you know, I think that you're right. Like the socialist political economy, just like instituting that in the middle of a massive civil war, probably quite a tall order. Um, but again, I think that that does speak to like, if you actually want to talk about how you're going to facilitate the production of goods, that doesn't just stop um, when you're in a civil war. But I mean, you know, to give credit to the anarchists, like he does talk about how a lot of these like anarchist controlled factories were able to like turn on a dime and start producing for military production like instantly and in a like massive scale once they got rid of the owners, which I thought was pretty interesting. Um, but yeah. Again, this stuff just did at times smack a little bit of political determinism in a way that I really wasn't expecting. But maybe, I don't know, maybe he's right. Maybe like in a time like that, what you do need is just a set political structure that isn't bourgeois and that will see you through to the end. Um, but yeah, without ever actually like, you know, it's like, well, I know we said we weren't going to bring up Endnotes 1 because we don't particularly remember what Gilles Devey was talking about in the sections on the Spanish Revolution. But the one thing I do remember him saying was that he criticized a lot of these organizations because he was like, syndicalism is, you know, maybe not the best way of thinking about things because an anarchist trade union is still a trade union, right? And so it's like, okay, you come out the other end of the Civil War and then what? You know, you've like gotten rid of Franco, you've gotten rid of all of these schmucks. Like, then what? What are you going to do? Well, then it's probably going to fall apart because your like distaste for any kind of transition, quote unquote, has led you to just like, okay, everybody take what you need and also just like please coordinate with each other. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I suppose this is the reason that a lot of kind of anarchist political economy almost seems to smack of like wanting a return to like petty proprietorship, whether or not people realize that or not, because that seems to be like where it would go. But what are you gonna do?
Yeah, I haven't really like read enough anarchist political theory to know um, whether the sort of worldwide federation of economic producers is how that comes about, kind of thing. If that is indeed what they propose, I mean, I don't know. Given entirely peaceful conditions and like a sort of complete takeover of Spain by sort of anarchism, like how would have people have chosen to relate to one another? Like, I don't know. Like he talks about a how both like the collectivized factory and the peasant commune like develop a kind of like slightly egoistic attitude, and how there's like a in some ways like how they have to be made later on to like interact with one another. Is that the general trajectory of that hypothetical mode of production, or is it that that's what happens under conditions of the pressures of war, and all the sort of attendant struggles that come along with that kind of thing? I don't really know.
Yeah. I mean, we're an anarchist. If you are an anarchist and you're listening to this, let us know. What is the plan? I feel like like especially if you're a syndicalist, I feel like the fundamental principle stuff would be like your bag, because it's like when you said, I don't know how the anarchists, like, you know, worldwide confederation of anarchist communes would work. I was like, yeah, that's silly. And then I was like, what we need is a worldwide confederation of councils. And I was like, wait a minute. Cascading councils. That's all you need. A couple other things that Goldner says that the anarchists should have done to unify nationally and to have made this work. He says, obviously, like what we've been saying, they should have smashed the state instead of just kind of like not quite kowtowing to like the broader Republican movement, but kind of just like accepting their place as more or less like kind of subservient to it to a certain extent. He says that he gives two things, one of which I think is a bit more interesting than the other one. One of them is they should have engaged in guerrilla warfare behind Franco's lines, which, yeah, I guess. Yeah, they should have won the war, I guess, too. They could have done that. I guess I don't really know how possible something like that would have been. You know what I mean? It seems like organizing on those lines probably would have been quite difficult. And then the second thing that he says was there should have been independence for Morocco from the get-go, which I thought was much more interesting because it's like, I don't know, whenever there's something like that, because, okay, like, Franco winds up launching his coup from Morocco with a lot of the loyal troops there, and that is kind of what spells the beginning of the end for this movement. I thought it was really interesting that it's whenever I come across something where it's like a piece of strategy is born from like actually living up to the morals that you seem to like espouse as just being like strategically correct. I'm like always a bit chuffed. I'm always like, oh, that's good. That makes sense. It's like, yeah, they should have given, independence to Morocco because that's the correct thing to do. But also it would have like, hey, maybe like some sort of revolution would have started there. Maybe it wouldn't have led to a base for Franco. It would have blah, 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 blah. Like you can just see the dominoes start to fall. It's kind of like a similar thing to what I was just saying about the self-management of the different industrial firms, about how that led to them becoming actually quite a bit more productive and just working a lot better, and people, being able to militarize really quickly. It's like, oh yeah, it's almost like this stuff works and makes sense and is also good.
I mean, what's really interesting, what underlies that decision on Morocco, I think, stems once again from Soviet interest and Soviet foreign policy. And what he says is that the Soviet Union very recently made a treaty with France. And so this seems to have multiple implications, right? Like there was a massive strike wave in France in the 1930s that was in part put down by the French Communist Party, again, because like the Soviet Union had this interest in stabilizing French politics. And obviously, similarly, France, the rest of Morocco, bar the little bit that was Spanish, was under French control. And obviously, they didn't want to set a precedent for independence in North Africa for various countries there who were colonial holdings. So there was this sort of like, it was French foreign policy and the Soviet Union's relationship to France that sort of came to influence these decisions being made by the Madrid government. And again, this generally just stems from the mistake that the anarchists made by allowing the sort of bourgeois government to limp on, because like the socialists and the communists were incredibly weak in 1936, and the sort of like at least the national government in Catalonia was ready to basically just hand over power to the anarchists because they saw how socially weak they were and how they didn't represent any kind of majority. And sort of coming back to the mistakes of the anarchists, right? Like it was leaving these forces in place, forces that were always going to be counter-revolutionary and were always going to work against the general revolutionary working class interests, but also organized anarchism, sort of leaving those in place that actively sought to undermine anarchism, but also like passively through policies that were taken undermined the fortunes of the revolution as well. This policy of toward Morocco, I guess.
Yeah. Kind of on, I guess, a couple other strategic things maybe to just touch on as well, because I guess that is kind of the whole point of this essay. We talked briefly a bit already about how they refused, the anarchist collectives kind of like refused to touch the banks in Barcelona, and how, that was kind of just born out of like a anarchist distaste for money, which fair enough. If you're on the left, you should not like money. That makes sense. But Goldner says that this in the end wound up, all of the banks basically just wound up being controlled by the Stalinists, without thought was kind of a bummer, and the various kind of like Soviet, not controlled, but perhaps influenced socialist parties that were always at odds with the anarchists during the Civil War. And so he said, obviously, they could have had a bit of a better relationship to how they dealt, I suppose, or better theorizing with how they dealt with the banks. Again, this just kind of is maybe one of the more typical on the nose examples of kind of like anarchist strategizing, where it's like, we don't like that thing, let's just ignore it and pretend that it doesn't exist and it won't come back to bite us, right? It's like, let's get rid of the cops, let's get rid of the military. What winds up happening is you have like the anarchist military and the anarchists, not like cops. Although I did think it was very funny about how he like took pains to be like, when some of these collectives were organized, they first things they did was like shut down brothels, which I thought was really funny. Yeah. They like outlawed fun. It was like Footloose.
There was a lot of I felt a lot of contradiction in some of the ways he was describing. I mean, it was really funny. There was a historian who described the attitude of the peasant commune in relationship to some of its social reforms as being representative of a kind of like neo-Lutheranism kind of thing that was setting itself against sort of decadent Spanish Catholicism, I guess. But then there was the sort of the aspect of like sort of free love, anti-marriage that was kind of thrown in with the sort of like shutting down brothels and the like resisting drinking and smoking and whatever else. I don't know. But I think in the general context of the way Goldner's writing about it, it's just it's intended to represent a kind of like utopianism. Like the ideal society is sort of like meant to, for the anarchists, sort of spring from the mind of the people participating in it rather than material movements in history kind of thing. But yeah, there's a few references to like anarchist communes practicing vegetarianism and naturism and all sorts of other things.
The vegetarian anarchist commune in Spain. Hell yeah.
Yeah. I mean like the there is a sort of slightly scary image of the sort of like the naked member of the Poom like running down the hill with his gun kind of thing. I don't know. Evocative of like, I don't know.
Yeah.
The Celts or something.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? It's like so much of this stuff, it's like it's utopianism, but it's also like this just predilection that some groups have, sects mainly, where it's like, I've seen through to the hidden fabric of the universe, which is dialectical materialism. And as such, I know exactly how you should live. And it's just like, or you could just like let the people themselves figure it out. It's like, if they wanted brothels, that's fine. Like if they wanted like, you know what I mean? Like if they wanted to eat meat, it's like, that's up to them. You know what I mean? But anyway, having said that, all communes should be vegetarian. Yeah. And then the last thing is just that by 1937, he says that all of the syndicalists were calling for a centrally planned economy, which is just incredibly funny and just goes to show like how things had decayed and how much they'd let slip past them. But the only thing that made me think of is just that, like, I'm sorry, but like anytime a centrally planned economy has been called for or instituted, quote unquote, like it's been because it's been fallen back upon, if that makes sense. Like people have fallen back on the idea of a centrally planned economy. And that's not the thing that you want to like move towards. It's never discussed by Marx. It's never discussed by Engels. It's just like, oh yeah, the centrally planned economy, that's the thing that we should be going for. Just like the Soviet Union. It's like the Soviet Union fucked up things so badly that they had to do that. And their centrally planned economy was neither centered or planned. You know what I mean? And it's like in Spain too, I could imagine that there's maybe someone out there, not to like make up a guy, but it's like maybe there's a guy out there who's like, yeah, then they finally realized that they needed to have a centrally planned economy. And only if they realized that beforehand, maybe they would have won. But it's like, not at all. Like they didn't want to do this at all. And like they had to do this. They had to fall back on a centrally planned economy. So it's just like, yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. I mean, that's if we were going to give a broad overview of the narrative presented here about the events of like 1936 to 1939, the period of the Civil War, it would be like the leadership of anarchist organizations, the CNT and the other trade unions, gradually, but well, initially refusing to depose the sort of very fragile bourgeois government, and then a few months later, like taking up cabinet seats in the Madrid government, and then gradually just moving further and further and further away from the political wishes of their primary constituency, like the anarchist proletariat, and moving more and more toward advocating the same things that the Republicans and the communists are advocating, as you say, like sort of movement toward a centrally planned economy, the sort of a shift in rhetoric towards saying what's happening is nationalization rather than like collectivization. So like increased introductions of like formal military organization, and this sort of just this sort of like and what then begins to happen is you have like political forces primarily represented by the communists who are then going into like collectivized farms or collectivized communes and sort of like forcing them to like accept sort of a new form of economic planning and organization, a centralized planning system kind of thing. Yeah, so there's just a sort of general disintegration of the revolution, partly because the anarchists didn't have enough of a positive program, and partly because the counter-revolutionary forces aren't just represented by Franco's military forces, but also the Communist Party, the Stalinist-backed sort of like aspects of the military, and the more mainstream republicanism as well. I don't know. That's my one long paragraph on what happens.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? And it's because the last section is Loren Goldner, summing everything up in a nice, concise left communist package,
which we appreciate.
Which we always love. Yeah. Well done.
I hate things that don't have a conclusion, which we have read.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I know. It's like, give me a break. Obviously, some people are going to try and have a podcast
about this. We just need to get a concise hour. Just like we'll read the introduction and the conclusion. We'll skim the middle, and there you go.
The middle bit, throw some dates out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny though, because like there's always this constant dichotomy in like left-wing circles where it's like, on one hand, what Goldner is saying here is like you need to actually be studying the real movement of things, how things are actually working, how things are actually unfolding, not trying to come to it with any kind of like preconceived notions or whatever. But then on the other hand, it's also like, there is theoretical underdevelopment that can fuck things up really badly in history. And I've always, I think, kind of had a bit of a hard time like putting those two things together. But I suppose that it makes sense, right? Because it's like, out of these mass movements, you get things like in Spain, spontaneous or maybe like, semi like maybe like the anarchist organizations semi help these collectives form right out of these mass movements. But then you also have the things that need to push them further and like try to organize them and make them last, right, and give them the tools that they need to last. And I suppose that it is that there are actually times in history where those organizations or those people involved in them do actually have outweighed historical importance, you know what I mean? And everybody knows who those people are in the Russian Revolution, but it is just interesting because I don't know, part of the time I just kind of fall back on like, well, things are going to fall, chips are going to fall the way that they are. It's like things are going to happen the way that they are. The mass movement can't really be changed. It's this monolithic thing that is born out of capitalist society, and it is what it is in our specific moment. But then it's also like, oh yeah, like theoretical development actually does play a pretty big role, because I'm always like keen to just roll my eyes at like egghead nerds that are like, no, my program is correct. But it's like, well, let's hope somebody out there has the correct program. You know what I mean?
It's funny, isn't it? Because like there are certain surface level contradictions that that come from what Goldner is saying the anarchists should have done, and then what his prescriptions are for us here in the 21st century. Like there's an extent to which what he's saying is the anarchists should have taken power, But his sort of like his prescription for contemporary political movements now is like, don't try and impose your particular ideology on the masses, I suppose, on people. Rather, you should look to the sort of what is emerging from political struggle and champion that and make yourself servant to that, I guess, would be my way of phrasing it. But of course, what he's really saying is that he's criticizing the anarchists for not having a sort of concrete analysis of events, and rather for having utopian aspirations for the society that's going to come about, but not really thinking about how that is actually going to happen, other than stripping away all of the things that are impeding it. And when it comes to his sort of like 21st century prescription for organizations today, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, you're like Marxist, Trotskyist, whatever kind of sect, like, don't think that your prescription is, don't treat your kind of like program as being in some ways the perfect utopian blueprint for what has to happen to transition us from capitalism to communism. But you have to recognize that that development will be something emergent from conditions as they happen, and what you need to do is engage conditions that are happening and push them in the right direction, or like work out how to best engage them to meet your political ends, but not to imagine that you're in some way master of the fate of the universe, I guess.
Which we all like to do.
Yeah, I mean, from time to time, it's a nice fantasy to entertain.
Yeah, I think really well said. I guess the trick comes when it's like everybody would say that they're studying the material realities, and what we actually need. The time is nigh for a workers' party. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You know, maybe it is. I don't fucking know. Mm.
But again, like he does, like, it's funny because he's not wrong to also say that what we need to take to people is a positive program for what a transition looks like, and to not do what I think he's describing lots of left-wing organizations of doing now, which is a kind of activism, right? Like, it's a focusing on, he criticizes them for focusing far too much on the next action, the next protest, the next like newspaper drive or whatever, and yeah, criticizes them for not having some kind of more expansive program for economic transformation, which we do need to take to the people, the masses, I suppose.
By way of
he's not. So he's almost, yes. by way of a secret sneak meme attack, you know.
Yes. Exactly.
But yeah, it's interesting that his politics seem not to be like purely spontaneous, kind of like take no action, kind of whatever. But
yeah, it's an interesting guy, because I know that on his rag, Insurgent Notes, or I imagine it's many people's rag, like Gilles writes for them, and so I was expecting this to be a like, you know, it's all gonna happen, man. Let it happen. Because it's funny, because like in the, maybe I was just lumping him in with the like ultra leftist stuff that we've read, like the hinterland kind of stuff, but like the hinterland stuff was almost like focus on the next action, focus on like, you know, the expense of everything else. This is a really interesting kind of like mesh of stuff in Goldner's work that we've found so far that I find it quite interesting and quite attractive. Actually, it's good.
Yeah.
Great.
Let's do that.
Let's do that. Well, maybe one day we'll go back and read the other two. There's one on Bolivia, and I forget what the fourth one was.
It's actually on the Soviet Union. I thought it was on Russia.
Oh yeah, it is.
Some period of Russian history.
That's right. Yeah. So maybe we'll read that one as well. I've also got some value theory to read, unfortunately, Dan. So you know,
have we?
Maybe. I mean, we did say we were going to finish that book at some point. So.
Oh shit! Yeah.
I burned that book.
You know, I remembered the book that I remembered was lineages of the absolutist state. We just read the last chapter and
that's
set
right.
that one down.
The appendix. We didn't even read the last chapter.
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, that's better, probably.
We're like, this is everything we need to know about Japan.
So I somehow convinced myself I'd read that book, and then I realized afterwards, no, actually, no, I haven't.
I think I've done that too.
Yeah, I don't know.
Chapters are long.
I don't know when that's going to come up. There's also nice some interesting references to anarchist military strategy in this, which I'd quite like to explore at some point as well. So.
Military strategy, we've spoken about that before.
Yeah.
We'll just read Clausewitz, and that's all we need to read.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
Great. So suffice to say, we will be back with something.
We will, with something.
Probably none of those things.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, enjoyed as always. Rest in peace, Loren Goldner. Thank you for this book. It's very, very good. One of these days, I'll actually get a paper copy of it. But until then, Dan, I had such a nice time. Thank you so much.
Yes, me too, Jack. It's been very nice once again to talk to you. Let's keep doing it.
We'll keep doing it. See everybody later.
All right, bye-bye.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.